April 18, 1943, Bougainville Island. A single smoking fighter spirals into the jungle canopy, vanishing in a flash of fire. The man inside was the architect of Pearl Harbor, and the only Japanese leader Americans were ordered to kill by name. What few in the West ever learned is that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spent years warning Tokyo that this war would end in disaster. He saw the future long before his nation believed it. Fact 1. The man who never wanted this war. To understand Yamamoto, you first have to picture him standing alone on the deck of the flagship Nagato, long before Pearl Harbor. The wind of the Pacific whipped across his face, but he barely noticed it. He wasn't a man dreaming of conquest. He was a man trapped between two loyalties, his love for Japan and his certainty that Japan was walking into a storm it could not survive. Yamamoto had lived in the United States. He studied at Harvard, walked the streets of Boston, watched the steel skeletons of American factories rise, and saw workers pouring out of them in shifts so large they looked like tides. He played poker with American officers, dissected their industrial power, and understood one truth that terrified him. If Japan provoked the United States into a total war, it would lose. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably, crushed under a mountain of oil, steel, and production lines running day and night. He carried that fear into every meeting in Tokyo. When nationalists shouted that America was soft, decadent, and weak, Yamamoto quietly shook his head. He had seen American colleges filled with thousands of students, aircraft companies capable of building more planes in a month than Japan could in a year, and oil reserves that dwarfed anything in Asia. He warned the Prime Minister himself. "If I am ordered to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I cannot promise anything." The officers around him didn't listen. Many believed in destiny, not mathematics. They saw empire where Yamamoto saw a cliff. So when the final decision for war came, Yamamoto didn't cheer. He simply bowed his head, accepted his orders, and began planning an attack he privately believed would be Japan's first triumph, and its last moment of real advantage. The irony is painful. The man who launched the strike on Pearl Harbor was perhaps the one man in the Imperial Navy who understood exactly how the story would end. And as the sun set that day on the Nagato, Yamamoto looked across the Pacific with a quiet certainty. He was watching the beginning of Japan's countdown. Fact 2. The poker table. That changed his mind. Long before Yamamoto became the face of Japan's Navy, he sat in a smoke-filled poker room in Washington, D.C., quietly studying the men across the table. These were American officers, broad-shouldered, loud, confident in a way that felt almost reckless. They joked as they played, but their easy laughter masked a deeper truth. They were the products of a country with near-limitless industry, money, and manpower. And Yamamoto, sitting with his slender frame and missing 2 fingers from the Russo-Japanese War, realized something that few in Tokyo ever understood. These men were relaxed because they could afford to be. He watched them gamble with the same instinct they built their navy, boldly, aggressively, with resources to burn. Every time he matched their bets, another thought echoed in his mind. Japan cannot win a long war against this. He studied their factories, their oil capacity, their shipyards. He walked through American cities with electric grids that lit entire districts at once, something unimaginable in many parts of Japan. Whenever he returned home, nationalists mocked America as indulgent and unfocused. Yamamoto quietly disagreed. He had seen American contradictions, their informality masking sharp discipline, their loudness hiding deep unity. He saw a people who could pivot instantly from peace to overwhelming war production. Years later, when Japan marched into conflict, those memories haunted him. Every booming laugh from those DC poker nights replayed in the back of his mind like a warning bell. Yamamoto never forgot what the cards had shown him. Americans didn't need luck. They had industry. Fact 3. The threat that forced Tokyo's hand. By 1940, Yamamoto had become a problem for Japan's extremists. His warnings were too direct, his predictions too uncomfortable. Every time he stood in a policy room, he shattered illusions that Japan could defeat the Western powers. Nationalist officers began whispering that this admiral was unpatriotic, that he lacked spirit, that he bowed too easily to foreign pressure. But their anger soon turned violent. One winter morning, as Yamamoto walked from his car toward Navy headquarters, intelligence officers intercepted him with a stunning message. Radical factions planned to assassinate him. His name appeared on hit lists circulated among ultra-nationalist societies. They hated him for opposing war with America. They hated him for being right. To keep him alive, the Navy made a drastic decision: remove him from Tokyo entirely. They reassigned him to command the combined fleet, far from the political volcano brewing in the capital. His transfer wasn't a promotion. It was self-preservation. He was safer at sea than in his own homeland. When he boarded the flagship Nagato to assume his new role, Yamamoto looked back toward the coast, fully aware of the bitter truth. He had been forced into the very path he hoped to avoid. From the safety of the waves, he now held the responsibility of designing the opening strike of the war he desperately tried to prevent. And so, the tragic irony unfolded. The man threatened with death for resisting war would become the mind behind Pearl Harbor, not from zeal, but because fate and politics left him no other place to stand. Fact 4. Pearl Harbor. His victory. His warning, December 7th, 1941. The radio message, "Tora, Tora, Tora," raced across the airwaves, echoing across the Pacific. Japan had achieved complete surprise at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, aircraft spiraled in flames, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet was left stunned. To the world, Yamamoto became the genius behind the strike, the architect of Japan's most famous victory. But to Yamamoto himself, that victory felt like a clock ticking down. As reports poured in, officers around him erupted in celebration. They believed history had been changed in a morning. But Yamamoto's face remained expressionless. He knew better than any man alive that Pearl Harbor was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of something much larger than Japan could control. He studied the list of destroyed American ships and felt no relief. He had wanted the U.S. carriers, and they had not been in port. He understood what this meant. America had been wounded, not crippled. Yamamoto had seen their industrial potential firsthand. Washington would respond with anger, unity, and steel rolling off production lines faster than Japan could replace a single aircraft engine. That night, while the fleet celebrated, Yamamoto sat alone in his quarters and wrote a private reflection. Victory would last 6 months, maybe a year. After that, he warned, Japan would face a reawakened giant. In his silence, he carried the burden no one else dared acknowledge. Pearl Harbor was Japan's strongest moment, and the point from which American power would rise like a tide. He had won the opening move, but he knew the board belonged to the United States. Fact 5. 6 months of fire. Before the fall. After Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prediction became a quiet prophecy inside the Imperial Navy. He had warned the government long before the attack. For 6 months, I can guarantee victory. After that, I can promise nothing. And for a brief moment, those 6 months arrived exactly as he said. Japan surged across the Pacific, taking Guam, Hong Kong, Wake Island, the Philippines, and sweeping deep into Southeast Asia. Newspapers in Tokyo printed maps that stretched like wings across the ocean. Officers spoke of destiny with a confidence that felt unstoppable. But Yamamoto watched these victories with a sense of dread. Every conquest demanded more ships, more aircraft, more fuel, none of which Japan could easily replace. The fleet was reaching farther than ever before, yet its lifelines were thinning. American production had not yet awakened, but Yamamoto knew it soon would. He had lived long enough in the United States to understand how quickly that nation could rise under pressure. What haunted him most was something no one else seemed to grasp. Every Japanese success triggered an equivalent American response. Each captured island hardened U.S. resolve. Every loss stoked their industrial engines. While Tokyo celebrated, American shipyards began working around the clock. New carriers, aircraft, and submarines moved from drawings to assembly lines with breathtaking speed. By the spring of 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto sensed the change. Japan was approaching the edge of its advantage. Their pilots were exhausted, their carriers stretched thin, their fuel reserves dangerously low. He saw the storm forming long before anyone else admitted it. The 6 months were ending, and once they passed, Japan would face a kind of war it could not win, one measured not in courage, but in production. Fact 6. Midway, the day his fears became reality. The Battle of Midway was more than a defeat. For Yamamoto, it was the moment Japan's future snapped in half. His plan was bold, complex, and dependent on surprise, a hallmark of his thinking. But at dawn on June 4, 1942, as American dive bombers pierced the sky over the Japanese carriers, Yamamoto understood something far more devastating than the loss of ships. The United States had learned how to anticipate Japan. When the first bombs struck the Akagi and Kaga, turning their decks into towering pillars of flame, the raw sound of the explosions carried a message that hit Yamamoto harder than any shockwave. The Americans were no longer reacting, they were predicting. Japan's advantage in training, strategy, and experience was evaporating in a single morning. From the bridge of the Yamato, he received reports of burning carriers and frantic crewmen jumping into oil-covered seas. The combined fleet, the pride of Japan, was being torn apart in real time. His officers watched him carefully, waiting for anger or panic. Instead, Yamamoto closed his eyes and exhaled, not in frustration but in recognition. This was the moment he had warned Tokyo about. The line between boldness and disaster had been crossed. Japan would never again rebuild carriers of that size or replace pilots with that level of training. The loss was not just material, it was generational. Behind every drowned aviator was a decade of discipline and skill that Japan could not reproduce. Midway was not the end of the war, but for Yamamoto, it was the moment he knew the ending. Fact 7. The private letters no one wanted to read. Hidden deep in government archives are letters Yamamoto wrote during the early Pacific War, carefully worded, respectful, but filled with a quiet desperation. They were addressed to high-ranking officials and ministers who rarely welcomed his tone. Yamamoto warned them that Japan was bleeding resources faster than expected. He pointed out that the United States was building carriers at unprecedented speed. He predicted that American submarines would choke Japan's supply lines. These were not the words of a defeatist. They were the words of a realist. But every time he cautioned restraint, he met the same reaction: irritation. Japan's leadership preferred optimism over arithmetic. They believed Japanese spirit could compensate for a lack of steel, oil, or industrial capacity. Yamamoto found this mindset dangerous. Spirit could lift morale, but it could not fuel aircraft or replace destroyed ships. In one letter, he described what he believed would happen if Japan did not seek a diplomatic path: a prolonged war, domestic starvation, and the eventual destruction of the imperial fleet. The ministers filed the letters away, hoping time would prove him wrong. Yet, inside those private lines, Yamamoto revealed emotions he never displayed publicly: exhaustion, fear for Japan's future, and a growing sense that he had become responsible for a war he had never supported. The burden weighed on him heavily. He carried the faces of thousands of pilots sent into battle with dwindling odds. He carried the knowledge that every victory Japan celebrated brought it closer to the moment of reckoning. His letters were not pleas, they were warnings, and history would confirm them all. Fact 8. The mission that should never have happened. In the spring of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a message containing the unthinkable: Yamamoto's exact flight plan. The time, the route, the altitude, everything. It was a stunning breakthrough, and Washington made a decision no military in modern history had ever made before. They authorized a mission to kill a single enemy commander by name. Operation Vengeance was born. Yamamoto, unaware of the danger, prepared for a routine inspection tour in the Solomon Islands. He believed morale among his forward units was collapsing and that his presence might steady the line. This wasn't the decision of a prideful admiral. It was an act of duty, an attempt to share the burden with the men fighting the hardest part of the war. At dawn, on April 18th, he boarded a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, its thin metal frame vulnerable to even small arms fire. His aides knew the aircraft was unsafe. Everyone knew. But Yamamoto insisted on flying it anyway. To him, leadership meant proximity. As the bomber cut across the jungle canopy, a squadron of American P-38 Lightnings closed in. They had been flying for hours at treetop level, risking fuel shortages and detection. The ambush was silent until the guns opened. The first burst tore through the bomber's engines. A second wave struck the fuselage. Yamamoto's plane dipped, then spiraled into the forest in a column of black smoke. The man who had tried to avoid the war, who predicted its outcome, and who carried Japan's heaviest truths, had been taken from the sky in a mission built from his own foresight. Fact 9. The crash site. Frozen in silence. When Japanese search teams reached Yamamoto's crash site deep in the Bougainville jungle, they found something that felt almost ceremonial. His plane had come down between towering trees, the wreckage still smoking, the metal twisted like wet paper. But Yamamoto himself sat upright beside the stump of a tree, his white gloves still on, his uniform immaculate despite the fall. There were no signs of panic, no struggle. It looked as if he had prepared himself for the end. The soldiers who recovered his body later wrote that the jungle was silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just the soft crackle of cooling metal. They approached slowly, almost reverently, because even then, even in defeat, Yamamoto carried an aura of tragic dignity. He had been the Navy's guiding star, the man who warned of the storm, the man who fought it anyway. One officer picked up Yamamoto's sword, still sheathed, and held it to his forehead as a sign of respect. Another quietly wept. They understood the weight of what had happened. Japan hadn't just lost an admiral. It had lost the one leader who understood the war's true shape, the only man who might have navigated a different path. When Tokyo received the news, they did not announce it immediately. The government feared the impact, feared the truth his death represented. But in the fleet, the sailors felt it instantly. The ocean seemed colder, the horizon seemed longer, and the war felt suddenly, unmistakably unwinnable. Fact 10. The funeral Japan tried to hide Yamamoto was given a state funeral of immense formality, but beneath the ceremonial precision, there was something hollow, a recognition that the war was slipping beyond Japan's control. His ashes were carried through Tokyo in a grand procession, lined with flags and thousands of spectators. But the people who watched did not cheer. They stood in heavy silence, sensing the shift in the air. The government presented Yamamoto as a martyr, the fallen shield of the empire. They magnified his victories, polished his legend, and framed his death as a symbol of Japanese resolve. But inside the naval staff, the story was different. Officers whispered that losing Yamamoto was losing the nation's last realistic strategist. The man who had begged Tokyo to avoid war was now used as proof of its righteousness. Even the funeral music carried a strange emptiness. The drums echoed across the capital, but instead of pride, they stirred a quiet unease. People knew the truth, even if it was never spoken aloud. If Yamamoto was gone, then the path ahead could only grow darker. After the procession, his ashes were placed in a small urn. Admirals bowed, soldiers saluted, civilians pressed their hands together in prayer. And somewhere in that moment, Japan understood that a chapter had ended, not just of a life, but of the illusion that victory was still within reach. Fact 11. The legacy. America understood before Japan did in the United States. Yamamoto earned a strange kind of respect, rare for an enemy commander in wartime. American officers who had met him remembered his intelligence, his courtesy, and his sharp understanding of global power. Even those who authorized the mission to kill him acknowledged something quietly. Yamamoto had not been their enemy by choice. He had been trapped by politics, nationalism, and the momentum of a country sliding toward disaster. Newspapers across America covered his death with a tone that surprised many readers. There was recognition of his brilliance, acknowledgement of his foresight, and even a measure of sadness. Americans understood something vital about him. He had been the only Japanese leader who truly grasped the scale of the fight. He did not underestimate America. He feared it, respected it, and tried to prevent the very war he later led. Historians would later point out that Yamamoto was one of the few figures in the Pacific War whose assessments consistently matched reality. He foresaw not only Japan's defeat, but the exact shape of that defeat: collapsing supply lines, overwhelming U.S. production, and the slow suffocation of an empire overextended. In the end, Americans saw the tragedy of Yamamoto more clearly than his own government did. They recognized a leader who knew the truth long before anyone else believed it. Fact 12. The Admiral who predicted the future. In the decades after the war, Yamamoto's writings, letters, and recorded statements were re-examined with a clarity impossible during the conflict, and a startling pattern emerged. He had predicted nearly everything: the failure to destroy U.S. carriers at Pearl Harbor, the collapse after 6 months, the decisive turning point at Midway, the fuel shortages, the submarine blockade, even Japan's final exhaustion. To younger generations, he became a quiet warning about the dangers of pride and the cost of ignoring uncomfortable truths. Yamamoto was not a prophet. He was a man who understood the arithmetic of war with painful accuracy. He saw the world not as he wished it to be, but as it was. And yet he did his duty anyway. That was the tragedy woven through his life. He fought a war he believed Japan could not win, guided men he feared he could not save, and carried a burden no victory could lift. His story is not one of triumph or failure, but of foresight ignored. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, there were officers who whispered his name, not loudly, but with a quiet recognition. Yamamoto had seen the ending 3 years before it arrived. He didn't just predict Japan's defeat. He lived with its shadow from the very first day. In the end, Yamamoto's life reads like a warning written long before the war began. A reminder that truth, even when spoken clearly, can vanish beneath the noise of a nation determined not to hear it.